Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Felipe De Brigard. He is Fuchsberg-Levine Family Associate Professor at Duke University. Most of his research focuses on the way in which memory and imagination interact, and today we're going to talk about that. So, Dr. De Brigard, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay, great. So let's start perhaps with some basic questions, perhaps some definitions, just for people to know what we're going to talk about here today. So, what is episodic memory?
Good. So episodic memory has been traditionally understood as the kind of memory in which, in addition to recollecting certain information about the past, you can also recollect the spatio-temporal context in which such information has been learned. So, for instance, your memory of your wedding or your memory of meeting a friend, in which you can sort of pinpoint in a space and time when that event happened and the conditions and circumstances under which that happened, that counts as an episodic memory. And it is typically contrasted with what Tolvin calls semantic memory, which is just the information of the fact devoid of any context or association with a particular spatial-temporal location. So I know, for instance, that the capital of Venezuela is Caracas, but I cannot recall where or when exactly I learned that information. That would constitute then semantic memory.
Right. And I mean, in your work, I read about counterfactual thinking. So, what is that and what is its relationship to episodic memory?
Good. Okay, so that's a big question. So counterfactual thinking is the psychological counterpart of a philosophical term, which is the term counterfactual, means literally contrary to fact. So my interest in counterfactuals started off from a philosophical perspective. I was really interested in the way in which we evaluated the truth of statements such as, "If I had wings, I could have been able to fly." That sounds interesting because it looks truthy to me, but of course it starts with an antecedent that is false because I don't have wings, right? And in philosophy, there's a lot of really interesting stuff in semantics of counterfactuals that was fascinating to me. But I was also fascinated by the fact that certain counterfactuals seem to come to mind more readily than others. So to give an example that has been very influential in my life by Douglas Hofstadter, if you walk into a pizza place and a slice of pizza, you have a slice of pizza and then it all of a sudden falls, the counterfactual that comes to mind immediately is, "Ah, man, if I had only been able to grab it before it touched the ground." But of course, there's a lot of other things that could have popped to your mind. If all of a sudden the laws of gravity had changed momentarily, or if it was socially acceptable to lick things off the floor, those things would have achieved also the same result. But it was some counterfactuals that come to mind more readily than others. So the relationship between those kinds of counterfactuals, those that come to mind very readily, and episodic memory became pretty apparent to me when I was in grad school, and I started thinking about the fact that some of our episodic memories are false, but the kind of falsehood is similar to those of the counterfactuals in the sense that it's a kind of event that we falsely recall as having remembered, but it is very close to what could have occurred. So I started thinking about episodic memories, false episodic memories, as a kind of episodic counterfactual. And that's how I see those two connected to one another.
That's very interesting. So that means that then when we have certain false episodic memories, for example, when we recollect something and we rewrite it, that it's not, I mean, the way we rewrite our memories is not random. I mean, it follows along these sort of counterfactual thinking and perhaps us thinking about what could have happened differently.
Correct, correct. Yeah, I definitely don't think that the way in which we reconstruct our memories is haphazard or random. It is, in fact, there is a long tradition in cognitive science of thinking about memories, reconstructive processes, as following some relatively well-constrained probabilistic strategies. So I am profoundly influenced by a strategy that's called the rational reconstruction of memory that is started off with cognitive scientist John Anderson, who gives us a relatively well-structured probabilistic sort of framework to think about how memory reconstructs. And the reason for why memory reconstructs in a way that is not haphazard is pretty straightforward. There is an adaptive purpose to the fact that memory doesn't save every little detail that you can see or perceive in your life. I don't know if listeners of this show are familiar with a wonderful story by Jorge Luis Borges called Funes de Memorias, which is about this individual in the Argentinian Pampa that falls off a horse and as a result of that loses his capacity to forget. And that story has an extraordinarily important insight, which is that forgetting is extremely important for your adaptive life. If you fail to forget details of your life, your mind, in a sense, is a mess. And memory takes advantage of this fact. We don't save or we don't store every detail of everything that we produce. Nevertheless, our memories are felt when we try to remember them, and we successfully remember. They are not. You don't feel the memory gapping. You don't feel that it comes with holes. So how do you feel those goals? Well, there are these rational strategies that Anderson talks about, which are basically probabilistic constraints. So in that's the way in which I feel that both episodic counterfactual thinking and episodic memory follow relatively similar strategies to fill up. So in one sort of brute way of putting it is that when your episodic memory is trying to remember an event that happened in the past, not all the details are there stored to be filled in, but those gaps are filled with similar strategies than the strategies that you employ when thinking about what it is likely that could have occurred. And oftentimes, when you're trying to remember, what comes to mind is exactly what happened, but oftentimes it's false. Nevertheless, in both instances, the processes are very similar.
So you mentioned forgetting, but why is it important for us to function normally to forget things? I mean, what would happen if we were to remember every single detail of everything that happened in our lives and couldn't forget them?
Good. Very good question. Forgetting occurs at different levels, right? So here is one example of forgetting that I think is essential. Emotions. When you have a very negative memory, your memory system has a sort of an innate strategy to make the negativity fade away. It is a very well-known phenomenon called the affect bias, the fading affect bias, in which the negative components of the valence of a negative memory tend to be sort of tempered down, mollified, as it were, as time goes by. And there is a lot of like reasoning behind that. Like, you don't want those negative memories to hurt as much when you remember them as when you encoded them, right? It would be really hard. We have to live with our memories. So that's one component and one instance in which forgetting is extremely adaptive. Here are other instances in which forgetting is extremely adaptive, and we know this from lots of research on categorization and reasoning and so forth. Sometimes details are distracting for generalization. So when you're trying to generalize on the basis of instances, it is very important not to focus so much in the things that are distinct between different items, and rather to focus on the things that are common among them. And that requires suppression of information, of distinctiveness information. So we do that. Our memory actually helps us to make those generalizations. Again, the insight in Borges is fantastic, because in Funes de Memorias, one of the things that happened to Funes as a result of being unable to forget the details is that the categories that he employed and the concepts that he employed started to be really useless for him, because he would see much more in common as as the example goes in the short story, he would see much more in common between a tree and a sunset in the city than he would see between one tree and another tree. And there is a lot of truth to that, not as poetically put, but we need to when you try to generalize, it is very important to forget distinct details and to highlight common details. So memory helps us often in situations in which generalization is the best strategy to go on, to make that trade-off. So that's another instance of forgetting that is important. And there are several others. Flexibility in thinking, it requires a certain kind of forgetting. So, I could go on and on different examples. We underestimate the importance of forgetting, but turns out that forgetting is essential for us to keep on going.
So I've focused my initial questions in episodic memory, but what about autobiographical memory? Is it, I mean, how do we form autobiographical memories? Are they constructed also in any way? How does it work?
Good. So autobiographical memories are an interesting category of memory. One of the most sort of influential models, which is the Conway-Planey model, suggests that autobiographical memories straddle both episodic and semantic, right? So when you think about memories about your life, your past, there are things that you know about yourself episodically, like, you might remember your first day at school, you might remember specific important events in your life. But in addition to that, you have, certain things about yourself semantically. It's like, oh, I know that I have these character traits. For instance, I'm generous, or I really, really like soccer, right? You might have the semantic fact that you like Cristiano Ronaldo, and I have the semantic fact that I don't, and that sort of thing. So those are things that are semantic. So autobiographical memory straddles and combines both episodic and semantic. In addition to that, another very interesting feature about autobiographical memory, which I am very interested in, is the fact that we're not very, even though autobiography by itself suggests that the time and the history of its format is essential, we're extremely bad at remembering times in our past. So we remember people, we remember places extremely well, we even remember objects extremely well, but we're often very confused as to when exactly something happened. I don't know if this is something that you can relate to, but if I tell you, for instance, like here is a very difficult one. If I ask you, hey, do you remember what you did the first Monday of July of 2020, you're going to have a real hard time. But suppose that was the day in which you broke a leg. So if I cue you with that specific event, you're going to have no trouble whatsoever remembering when, or like the situation in which that happened, right? So time is an extremely bad cue for autobiographical memory. Additionally, if I ask you, so not only if I cue you, but if I go like, when did this event happen? And the event happened really far in the past, you're going to actually be very likely to distort when the event happened, unless it was one of these events in which a date is incorporated into the event itself. So 9/11, people remember when 9/11 was because, well, it was in part of its name, 9/11. But you often distort an enormous amount of time. You tend to distort times much more. So that's a very interesting aspect of autobiographical memories, which is that the time component of those memories doesn't seem to get stored or categorized in our memories in the same way in which, say, places and people and objects are.
Right. And since we're talking about autobiographical memories, I mean, for us to function properly, does it have to be a narrative? I mean, do we need a narrative for our lives for us to function properly? Because that's something that many people bring to the table, that we have to have this sort of coherent narrative of our lives, otherwise we won't function properly. But is that really the case, particularly if, with the kinds of things you've been talking about, like how we easily forget things related to time and so on?
That's a great question. There is not only a lot of research, but a lot of interest in narratives these days. I I don't know why is it that narratives are important. I think that I might come back to sort of a Kantian response to that question, namely that that we are somewhat structured cognitively to experience things as continuous in time. So for Kant, famously, the form of the internal sense was time, and I always was very interested about the fact that we are cognitively temporal creatures. And it looks as though there is just a basic cognitive necessity, demand, if you want, of having to structure our experience as flowing in a spatio-temporal situation. But time is, particularly time, and like making it flow, and that temporal structure, I tend to think, is also probably causal. So we want things not only to happen one after the other, but we want to see causal continuity and causal relevance of items going on until another. And once you combine those two very basic cognitive demands, it seems to me that narratives just naturally follow. So the notion of a narrative is also very fluctuating, and I have been reading about narratives in memory for a very long time, and sometimes people have a very primitive notion of what a narrative is, in the sense that you might not even require language, for instance, to have narratives. Like you might imagine pre-verbal infants engaging in some sort of narrative in which the narrative is this sort of temporal / causal structure of events that form a coherent structure. So my sense is that if you think about narratives in this very primitive sense, then they just follow directly from very basic cognitive demands of thinking about our experiences temporally and probably also as causally connected. That being said, then one thing that I would push against is that some people said that because you lose your memory, you lose your capacity to make narratives. And I think that that's actually not right. My sense is that all you need is something like a working memory to generate these narratives. What William James called the spacious present, the capacity to extend your cognitive present through time, even for a little bit. I think that HM had perfectly fine narratives. I think that HM was perfectly able to construct this kind of spatial elongation of his spacious present, thanks to the fact that he had a decent, I don't think impeccable, but I think he got a decent working memory. I think that individuals, for instance, who have other kinds of memory problems, like confabulatory problems as a result of prefrontal cortex damage, have also the capacity to engage in these narratives. In fact, one of the leading sort of symptomatologies of Korsakov's based or Korsakoff-induced confabulations is this need of generating narratives that have very little to do with reality, but nonetheless are structured, are coherent, even if for the moment. So my guess is that again, this need for narratives is a natural fallout of our innate cognitive demand of having to see the world as spatio-temporal flux with causal concatenations.
But do those needs, those sort of cognitive needs, translate into things like, for example, we having to have a narrative that corresponds to a beginning, a middle, and the end of our life, and having to have a clear sense of our identity and perhaps specific goals? I mean, this sort of more elaborate narrative. Do you think that people really need to have that to lead normal lives?
That's a good question, and I think that there is. It depends on what you mean by they needed to have normal lives. I think that narratives are extraordinarily helpful in social contexts. I think that a lot of what we do narratives-wise is for the sake of living in social communities. We remember narratives extremely well, perhaps because they are just attuned to that causal structure of our segmentation of life, right?
Right.
And we are in part a lot of the stories that we tell are. Think about the fact that most of what we do when we get together with friends or with family is to engage in this process that people call joint reminiscing. Like I'm sure that that's a lot of what you do with your friends, particularly during time of COVID, where nostalgia is just evolving. People just sit together to jointly reminisce. A lot of the time, because jointly reminiscing has a very important present purpose, which is to evoke events that usually tend to be nice events, right? So if it's good. Like remembering good thing makes you feel better at the time of recollection. This not only at the time of encoding. So we often engage in those kinds of sort of joint reminiscing, like meetings, if you want, with your friends or with your family. Narratives are just extremely good vehicles for episodes to be re-evoked. So my inclination is to think that we employ these narratives to reminisce and to encode our memories because they are extremely good vehicles for episodes to be remembered, to be reinstated. So I see them as feeding one from another. It's just like a really good way of episodic memory to be re-elaborated in community particularly.
By the way, when we talk about memory, does it always have to be conscious? I mean, is all memory conscious, or are parts of memory that are not, that are unconscious?
That's a that's also a very loaded question. So according to sort of the traditional view, which is sort of the standard model of memory, which we owe to a number of people, but perhaps most importantly to Larry Squire, memory tends to be divided by whether or not it is conscious at the time of both encoding and at the time of retrieval. So he famously distinguished between declarative memories and non-declarative memories, first thinking that language was sort of the marker of the two, but later on has been that distinction has been established in terms of explicit versus implicit memory. An instance of implicit memory, which is memory that does not require conscious awareness for its encoding or its retrieval, is priming, is memory priming. So for instance, an example of that is I might give you sort of a little paragraph for you to read prior to an experiment, and that paragraph has to do with doctors, with hospitals, nurses, and so on and so forth. And then later on, I ask you in what you think is an unrelated memory test to complete a bunch of word fragments. And maybe one of those word fragments is DOC. The likelihood of you completing DOC with any word, for instance, document, is really high, right? But if you have seen the paragraph that involves hospitals and nurses and so on, then your probability of completing that word fragment with the word doctor goes really, really high. So a lot of the people that work in priming, what they measure is just basically the probability of recollecting doctor when you have been cued with DOC and prior having seen this list. relative to the probability of completing it with any other highly available word. And what it turns out is that if you have been primed, you tend to complete it with doctor more often than not, suggesting that there is something there. And even if I ask you, hey, dude, why did you complete it with doctor? You say, I don't know, it's the first thing that popped to your mind, that popped to my mind. So you won't remember the causal connection between the primer and the prime. Nevertheless, the behavior is there, the performance is there, right? So that suggests that there is something that was stored that at the time of retrieval you were unaware of, and more importantly, that you were unaware of the connection between the one and the other. And there's tons and tons of research on priming that suggests that the effect is actually quite stable through time. So that is an instance of unconscious memory, if you want. Now, it's interesting because I don't think that all episodic memories, by contrast, or that all semantic memories, by contrast, are conscious. I think that there's a lot of trafficking of episodic information in your mind that you are not necessarily aware of, but that is playing a certain role in your life. And the best instance of that is what researchers call involuntary autobiographical recollections. So I don't know if this is an event that happens to you, but it happens to a lot of people regularly, is that you're all of a sudden imbued by these episodic events in your past by no reason whatsoever. So all of a sudden you walk into a room and you get this memory. So like, oh man, this just reminds me of this particular event. Sometimes you even reconstruct the reason as to why that memory has come to your mind. You might say, oh, it might be the smell of this room that reminded me of this particular location, or it might be, this table or what have you. Sometimes those reconstructions are post hoc. We actually don't know exactly what the cue was. Right. But my sense is that many of those episodes have been going under the threshold of your awareness. And for one reason or another, there is a cue that just interacts with that memory trace, if you want, and makes it conscious. So understanding why is it that certain episodic memories are conscious as opposed to unconscious, and why is it that the conscious experience of those episodic memories feels the way in which it does, those are questions of ongoing research, and definitely questions that I'm profoundly interested in.
Mm-hmm. So changing topics now, what is imagination?
Wow. Speaking about a complicated issue. So, yeah. So if you thought that memory was a complicated concept, imagination is 10 times more complicated than memory.
Okay.
I think that imagination covers a large number of different cognitive sub-processes. Many years ago, when I was in grad school, I was thinking that I wanted to write a paper that was going to be sort of the equivalent of the memory systems paper for imagination, and I wanted to separate all sorts of different kinds of imaginations. I think nowadays that job is probably not only much more daunting than I initially thought, but also probably useless, because I think that people employ imagination to refer to something that it is not a cognitive kind. It is, I think we employ imagination to refer to a number of different processes that are more likely to be separate cognitive processes. So people employ imagination, for instance, to refer to daydreaming. They refer to imagination. They use imagination to refer to planning. Mm-hmm. They use imagination to refer to acting, to playing, to counterfactual thinking, and my guess, not only my guess, a lot of my own research suggests that cognitively those things are pretty different, operate under relatively different rules, and more importantly, if you care about neuroimaging, engage different cognitive processes. And not only if you care about neuroimaging, we know, for instance, that individuals with mediotemporal lobe damage have difficulty engaging in certain things that people call imagination, but not in others. Just to give you an example, perspective taking in mentalizing the capacity to imagine myself in the situation of someone else is something that we thought out of neuroimaging research that probably would require the mediotemporal lobes, and in particular the hippocampus, which is very relevant for memory. And beautiful work by Shine and Rosenbaum at the University of York in Toronto show that actually individuals with mediotemporal lobe damage have no problem passing certain imaginative tasks that require perspective taking. However, when that perspective taking requires information about the past, they're going to have difficulty, clearly, not only information about the past, but information about people that they have found in the past. So when you start separating, so you see, these are imaginative tasks that that we didn't know could be separated into this specific kind of subclasses, right? So imagining someone else's perspective, but when that person is someone that I know, I would have difficulty with because I need the hippocampus. But imagining someone else's perspective when I have no information or I don't require information about these people from the past, I have no trouble with, right? Likewise, there is some beautiful work by Beldarrain and others showing that spontaneous counterfactual thinking is impaired when you have damage in prefrontal cortex, but I can guide you to generate those episodic counterfactual thoughts, no problem, even if you have damage in prefrontal cortex. So the point is, all of these are tasks that from a folk psychological perspective, you would brand under imagination, but from the cognitive science perspective and from the perspective of psychology, they turned out to be very different kinds of sub-processes. And as a result, I just don't think that imagination is an interesting or reliable cognitive kind. You can use it to refer poetically, if you want, to a bunch of different cognitive processes, but I don't think that it is the kind of classification in cognitive science that it is going to make us move forward.
So, but even if it's not a psychological kind, as you say, can we at least associate it with certain functions? I mean, can we say that imagination is good for this or that, for example?
Sure. What you end up happening is that you employ, you adjectivize imagination, if you want. You make it a subclass depending on the kind of process. Imagination is extremely useful for lots of things. For instance, my colleagues and I just published a paper showing that engaging in active imagination about future addictive behavior could be very helpful in reducing your intentions to engage in that addictive behavior in the future. So I can tell you, I used imagination, but I sort of parcel that kind of imagination, or sort of modify that kind of imagination with an adjective that made it a kind of imagination that is episodic simulation, very concrete for future planning. But that kind of imagination is very different than the imagination of, I don't know, when you're playing Dungeons and Dragons and you're imagining that you're slaying a red dragon, or imagining yourself casting a particular spell and so forth. Both I call imagination, but I'm using the term with a qualifier for the very specific sub-process that I put to work with. And notice, for instance, that I can employ imagination for beneficial and also for damaging purposes, right? So a lot of my work and work that was conducted by my previous grad student, Natasha Parikh, and who is now a professor at UNC, is precisely to harness certain kinds of imaginations that are for the benefit, rather than to continue using them for sort of maladaptive purposes. So here is an example. Regret. Regret is a kind of imaginative exercise. Typically, we engage in regret-producing imaginations when we imagine how a past event that turned out bad could have turned out better. oh man, if I hadn't told this person such and such, then this negative event wouldn't have occurred. And that typically is an act of imaginative, generation that produces regret, feelings of regret. And for some people, for instance, for individuals with generalized anxiety disorder with and without depression, regret is recalcitrant. Regret keeps on coming, right? Uh, so, so that's a kind of imagination that is kind of like bad news. But maybe
Yeah.
we can harness imagination precisely to achieve exactly the opposite result, namely to make those recalcitrant thoughts less frequent, less hurtful. So a lot of the work that we did is to engage, instead of engaging in episodic, upward episodic counterfactuals, namely imagining a better way in which that negative event could have occurred, we asked individuals to engage in downward counterfactual thoughts, imagining worse ways. So like, suppose that you said something mean to someone, and as a result of that, the event was negative. Now I want you to imagine saying something even meaner. Like, you could have said something worse. Come on. Like, or you imagine lots of other ways in which the event could have been even more hurtful. And then you sort of reframe, if you want, that narrative about that event, and it tends to help. So that's another instance in which imagination turns to cover uh, two different kinds of cognitive processes that have actually quite different uh, valence or emotional effects. So, in our case, in the case of doing like scientific psychology, imagination ends up being an umbrella for processes that are actually quite opposing to one another.
So, because previously we talked about memory, what is the relationship between memory and imagination?
That's a good question, and one that I like to give a pictorial answer to. Um, think about them as intersecting sets that are not fully overlapping. So imagination and memory share cognitive processes, specifically for the purposes for certain purposes, right? And if you think about it, a lot of the real concerns in both psychology and in philosophy about the relationship between memory and imagination had to do with that intersection. No, like very few philosophers, Hobbes perhaps being the exception, uh, would think that imagination and memory fully overlap. But very, very few philosophers, sadly, many in the uh, traditional analytic philosophy view, think that they are completely non-overlapping. The traditional view, I think, and the more commonsensical and the more obvious view is that they somehow interact, that there are instances in which we mistake imaginations for memories and that we don't feel it at all. I mean, a lot of the times there are lots of false memories that we live with that we're never ever going to know of them as being false, unless there is some evidence to the contrary, right? False memories are extremely ubiquitous, are extremely common, and and we can talk about what it means for a memory to be false, because that's also a huge kind of worms. But the point is, they do overlap in instances. Understanding exactly how and when do they overlap is what makes them so interesting. But there are also lots of instances in which they don't. It is very rare, if not impossible, and if it happens, you probably want to see someone, that when I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons, I know I'm not engaging in an exercise of joint reminiscing. Thinking jointly with my friends while I am adventuring and going down an imaginative path of killing a beholder or so forth. I could think that it has come across that I like Dungeons and Dragons. When I'm engaging in this exercise with my friends, I know, and everyone knows, that I am engaging in an extremely different exercise than the exercise that I engage in when I am thinking about my high school days with my friends from high school, or my college days with my friends from college. Those are, from the point of view of uh, the situation might not be that different. We're at a kitchen table, having a drink and maybe, conversing and thinking and laughing. But cognitively, what we're doing is profoundly different. And we know that in one case, we engage imagination, and in another case, we're engaging in reminiscing. So they are profoundly different in certain circumstances, but there's a realm of overlap between the two that I don't think it can be denied.
So I would like to tackle one last topic here. What is your position in regards to free will? Do you think that free will exists?
That's an interesting question. So back when I was in grad school, my professor Bill Lycan used to say that there are two kinds of philosophers: those for whom the problem of free will is very strong and pulls and has a lot of pull, and those for whom they don't. And I am in the latter camp. Um, I have a real hard time thinking about the problem of free will in the traditional deterministic kind of sense, partly because, and I think that I am profoundly influenced by Dan Dennett in this camp, partly because I think that the timing of cognition is very different from the timing of the events that go on in the brain. So when I think of mental states, if you want, from the intentional stance, the temporal component of those temporal events does not match the temporal components in which I can think of the causal interactions going on in my brain, right? Decisions occur at a temporal granularity that is different from the temporal granularity of neural events. That is, so when I think about that mismatch, so if you think about Libet, Libet's work, and I think about this is something that I talked a whole lot with my wonderful colleague Walter Sinnott Armstrong, who has thought a lot about these issues. I just think that there is an issue of operationalization. Libet thinks decision is such and such, but no decision occurs like the flickering of a button when watching a clock. It's a category mistake almost, if you want. The timing of the decision from the intentional stance, if you want, is just a very different timing than what you operationalize brain-wise in a tiny little kind of experimental paradigm as a decision. So I have never been extraordinarily compelled by those sorts of arguments for determinism. Mm-hmm. Now, that being said, I think that there is a more interesting problem of free will that I call the second order problem of free will, which is the fact that we are the product of the beliefs that have been inculcated upon us. We are the product of the things that we read, the teachers that we hear, the parents that we have, and so on and so forth. So I have been much more curious about the fact that, if there seems to be, suppose that you believe that there is something like psychological laws, like causal connectedness between things at the psychological level, mm-hmm. Then there is an interesting question about free will there, which is the fact that could I have thought otherwise? Could I have engaged in certain kinds of belief practices? Or am I just the product of the fact that I read that book, that I had that teacher, that I had these parents, right? I find that a much more interesting problem of free will, the problem of free will that happens at the intentional level, because it forces you to think in this interesting way. So on the one hand, you have to think, well, maybe I'm not the product of this, so I could have chosen otherwise. I could have chosen to believe otherwise. I could have, but then it looks as though the things that I end up believing are not really the nomological result. They're not the causal result of the things that I read before. And that sort of puts in jeopardy the idea that we can actually find something like psychological effects that are causal-like, right? So that is a kind of free will problem that I do think it is worth struggling with, because on the one hand you have this idea that either I accept that I am the inevitable result and that my beliefs are the inevitable result of all the beliefs that I acquired through my life, and thus I was sort of determined to think the way in which I think, or I am forced to think that maybe the connection between those beliefs and the way in which those psychological states occur is not nomological. But then what is the status? What am I doing as a psychologist? What is what I am trying to uncover as a psychologist, if not something that has law-like structure? So that is a problem of free will for me, that it is much more interesting than the determinism free will problem.
Right, but okay, so in terms of the kinds of problems that you think are interesting as you frame them, do you have any answers to them?
Yes, my answer for that kind of second order problem is that psychology is not in the business of finding laws. That we as psychologists are trying to do something more like investigating certain constraints. And mind you, I don't have a full-fledged answer because I myself waffle between these things. I do think at times that psychology as a science is hopelessly doomed, that the best things that we can do are find something like constraints that are extraordinarily non-scientific in the sense that physics say is scientific. Sometimes I'm a little bit more optimistic. Sometimes I am optimistic in the sense that I think that there are certain areas of psychology that are likely to be much more law-like, and those areas are highly peripheral, such like psychophysics. I think that psychophysics is profoundly strong. I think that certain areas in cognitive neuroscience are profoundly strong. But higher order processing, and I can't believe this is coming out of my mouth, but I tend to agree with Fodor sometimes to the effect that something like central processing in cognitive science might not be amenable to the kinds of explanations that we might find in more sort of law-like sciences like physics and so on and so forth. That being said, I'm not entirely sure that what we're doing is completely useless. Understanding what is the use of that is still an open question. Maybe psychology is not something that has to explain effects at the individual level, but at the group level, and then it might have certain uses for organizations and stuff like that, more than for individual psychological purposes. So the short answer is I do think that that there is something interesting about this second order problem of free will. The belief yields belief, and that the solution is going to be something like giving up the more nomological character of the scientific enterprise of psychology.
Mm-hmm. So, but I mean that second order questions about free will, do they have anything to say, or are they interested in questions about moral responsibility, or is free will there tied to moral responsibility in any way?
Yes, I would think so. I mean, if you are the child of an extraordinarily difficult circumstances, if you have been verbally, physically, violently abused throughout your childhood, if you live in an environment that it is also structurally and socially unequal, unfair, lopsided against you, there is that component of the inevitability of developing certain beliefs, developing certain practices of survival. And questions about moral responsibility become pretty murky, I think. I have a real hard time thinking that individuals that are highly educated, that are privileged, that have come to be and to grow up on an extraordinarily privileged circumstances and do something evil and do something wrong, I have a much harder time relinquishing their moral responsibility relative to those who have grown in extraordinarily bad circumstances, right? I think that second order problem of free will might sneak in my judgments of responsibility right there. I tend to be more likely to leave one of these individuals that have come that have grown under these difficult circumstances off the hook relative to others, just simply because they should have known better, right? The person that grew up privileged and so forth, the Bernie Madoffs of the world, they should have known better because they could have known better, right? Whereas the individual that didn't have any other alternatives, and goes back to the counterfactual stuff, many of them couldn't have known better because they didn't have the episodic or the semantic information to build a counterfactual simulation out of, right? Bernie Madoff had it all, right? He should have known better. So I think that once again, going back to imagination and to the moral responsibility of imagination, education and knowledge and privilege, it gives you an enormous amount of raw material to generate mental simulations for alternative ways in which you could have behaved. An impoverished life, a life that is loop-sided to give you certain kinds of experiences, is by de facto determined to bias the kinds of memories that you're going to be able to employ to generate those mental simulations with. And thus the options that become available to you are going to be profoundly loop-sided. So yes, there is a connection with moral responsibility. One thing that I think is important, though, that often, especially philosophers, sort of don't think about, is that I think that our legal system, and by our legal system, I think of the American legal system, but also the Colombian legal system, which is another one that I am familiar with, is that they are somewhat thought of to incorporate that component. So one thing that I really like about the word sentence, so when the judge comes with a sentence, is that it comes from the Latin sententia, which means filling. Judges have the authority, and it is part of their jurisdiction, to incorporate these kinds of ameliorating circumstances in their sentence, right? Mm-hmm. And they often engage in that exercise and thinking, look, Bernie Madoff, he should have known better. And you can even think cognitively that the fact that he was able to engage in all those counterfactuals and decided to act otherwise should count toward his sentence. He deserves way more, much more punishment than the poor person who grew up in these extraordinarily awful circumstances. That doesn't mean that every judge is going to exercise that discernment while coming with their sentence, but they should and have the possibility of doing it, and is built into our legal system. So I think that's sort of an important insight of the law that sometimes people in philosophy that talked about free will and responsibility being sort of ameliorated by circumstances tend to overlook.
Mm-hmm. So just one last question. Do you think that the beliefs people hold about free will, if it exists or not, and moral responsibility have any bearing on how they think about their own moral selves?
Yes, likely. And also have bearings on the things that they care about, and have bearings on the kinds of social contexts that they want to live in. So in that sense, I was, for better or for worse, I was initially profoundly influenced by Peter Strawson, but thankfully I was disabused of some of the bad Strawson and some of the good Strawson by reading Manuel Vargas' work. So I have been profoundly influenced by Manuel Vargas's work in this kind of view. I think that moral responsibility and our practices of moral responsibility play important social roles, and social roles also to ourselves. Mm-hmm. Whether it is because it's the kind of world that we want to live in, or if it is just the kind of experience that we want to have moving forward. So to give you an example, I think that if you have a brain tumor And it is pretty clear that as a result of that brain tumor, you engage in certain, criminal acts, that you shouldn't be punished. I don't think it wasn't up to you whether or not to generate that brain tumor, and it was a result not up to you whether the behavior that resulted of that brain tumor was good or not. But suppose that brain tumor is raping little girls, and suppose that the person that we're talking about is my neighbor, and suppose that I do have a little girl. Am I going to feel differently? Probably. And is it going to be rational for me to think differently? Probably not. What am I responding to? Well, I have these reactive attitudes, and these reactive attitudes have a particular social role in my life. So anyways, I definitely recommend to the listeners to read the work of Manuel Vargas, which is profoundly insightful here.
Yeah, and by the way, I had him on the show, so I have an
Okay.
episode with him, so I will also recommend for people to watch it. Okay, so just before we go, where can people find your work on the internet?
Oh, they can just check my website, the imclab.org. IMC stands for Imagination and Model Cognition Lab. It is on my website, as well as the Philosophy Department and the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience and the Psychology and Neuroscience departments at Duke University.
Okay, so Dr. De Brigard, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. I would just like to ask you if you can to please consider supporting the show for it to keep running. You will find links to my Patreon page and also to PayPal in the description box of this interview. Any amount, even just $1 per month, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. And finally, I would like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Kenan Litske and Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Laurero Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Henry Kalenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Curson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, John Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslem Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall. My producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sérgio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Venegdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Nirban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michelle Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.